Welcome all to FSA Learning Module 12, an introduction to financial statement modeling. Not going to be much in here, so it's going to be, as you can see, a short video. Reason for that, you've obviously got a practical module where you can have a look at how modeling works, and a lot of concepts that are introduced here are actually from elsewhere in the curriculum. So really all we're doing is tying together things we already know, putting them together, and then the module walks through a case study. Now, if you go into the online learning environment, into the ecosystem, you'll be able to see the case study they've used, download the Excel files for the model and walk through it. And I highly encourage you to do that. What I'll do is just walk through what I think are the interesting points and the links we can make to elsewhere in the syllabus, just so you can see where this ties in. The first LOS gets us to demonstrate the development of a sales-based pro forma company model. So this is where the Excel spreadsheet will be helpful just to walk through. It's literally just putting it together, a fairly simple model to be fair, but putting together a model to build an income statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow. So as I say, all I want to do is walk through how it works, the links, and where you can find the relevant pieces in the curriculum. And the first stage in building a simple model like this is to build the income statement. We're going to go income statement, cash flow, and then balance sheet. Income statement first in this simple process will forecast revenue. If you've got several segments, and you'll see the walkthrough example for Remy Martin that you have, does have several segments, and you can do this at a consolidated level and then check it by segment to make sure you've got a kind of sense check in there. But we'll forecast revenue, the key drivers in terms of volume. Missing a parenthesis there. In terms of volumes, what drives it? Organic growth and acquisition. Obviously here, with the organic element, you're going to have to look at macroeconomic factors, as we've seen elsewhere, or as you will see elsewhere if you've not yet been into the world of equity. In industry and company analysis, you can take a macro approach. You can look at GDP growth, tie your company's growth to that by saying, okay, are we going to grow as fast, faster, or slower than the economy, GDP? And then we can build into that whether we think our market share is going to grow, stay stable, or shrink. And from that, try and get an idea of revenue growth. Prices will obviously also be important. On individual products, do we have the ability to increase prices? We'll mention Porter's 5 forces, which again is in equity. And the overall price will also be affected by the product mix. Are you shifting towards your premium products or away from them? And Forex, if you're an international business, then you have to consider the impact of Forex. You'll see in this model, it's a fairly simple one. They're not going to put any adjustments in there for anticipated changes in exchange rates. So get your revenue. That is stage one. Once you have revenue, then you can start to use your ratios to link that revenue to the rest of the key numbers you need in the account. So for example, starting at the top of the income statement with revenue, next comes cost of goods sold. You'll forecast gross margin. If you know revenue and you know the gross margin, you can forecast COGS. Exactly the same for SG&A and other expenses. If you know typically what percentage of revenue SG&A is, you can forecast it as a percentage of that revenue figure. Other, often small, often difficult to predict. So you'll see in this simple model, they just ignore it and say, we're not going to predict anything for other. So you've got revenue, COGS, operating expenses. Below that in the income statement, your non-operating expenses, you have interest and tax. Interest, if you're lucky, is going to be fixed. It will be disclosed in the financial statements. You'll see it in the footnotes. They'll tell you what they're paying if it's fixed debt. If it isn't, if it's variable, then you're going to have to get a market reference rate, an MRR, and forecast where you think that is going. Obviously, an additional twist to your forecast. Interest income. If they have liquid assets lying around that they are earning income on, then you'll have to forecast a rate. You could use historical rates or again, look at an MRR. And for income tax, we talked about this back in the deferred tax or the taxation module. In the income statement, your effective rate is your tax expense divided by your earnings before tax. So you can look historically to see what that effective rate is. And unless you've got any reason to think it's going to change, use that going forward. That will get you down to your net income figure. Why do we need shares outstanding, you might be asking, if we're on the income statement? Well, shares outstanding will need to turn net income into earnings per share. Two main reasons shares outstanding may change: equity-based compensation and share repurchases. Equity-based compensation, stock options for employees, and share repurchases are obviously self-explanatory. Again, in this simple model, they're just going to assume any equity-based compensation that's being paid at the minute and charged in the income statement stays constant. And there are no share repurchases. Keeps it nice and simple. Where can you find this information? Remember back to the income statement module. EPS and diluted EPS will disclose everything you need to know in here. That's the income statement. Next up, as I say, the cash flow. Be careful about that. It kind of sometimes intuitively in your head, you just think, oh, I'll go income statement, balance sheet, cash flow. It's cash flow next because we're nearly there. If we've got net income, we are pretty close to having CFO. Remember back to the cash flow module and think particularly back to the indirect method of getting CFO. Our starting point there was net income. Now, using revenue, using the COGS percentage, SG&A percentage, assumptions about future interest, tax rates, and so on, you will see if you download the Excel spreadsheets that the forecasted net income figure they're using in their model is 179. They forecast it out for a few years. I've just given you an example here of 2022's estimated. They get to net income of 179. We're going to start with that forecasted net income from our pro forma income statement to get to cash flow. So let's remember what we learned in that cash flow module. Net income is great as a starting point, but we have to adjust for any non-cash items. The classic example, the most common, depreciation and amortization. Easy forecast. Assume it's a percentage of prior year fixed assets. We need that to add back to CFO. You'll see, using an assumed percentage, they get to depreciation and amortization of 36 and add that back. We'll also need to get to CFI, CapEx, the cash being spent on new assets. Once again, classically, it is just a percentage of revenue. You can see here already how important it is to try and have some degree of accuracy with your prediction of revenue. And you can see down in CFI here, there's the CapEx. They forecasted 55. Again, that is a percentage of revenue. But back to CFO for a moment. We started with net income. We've added back depreciation and amortization, a non-cash expense. Are there any other non-cash expenses? Well, it turns out in their model, they found one: share-based compensation. Remember from the liabilities module, if there is share-based compensation, the company needs to take the fair value at the grant date and spread that as an expense through the income statement over the service period. Not a cash outflow, but it must be recognized as an expense, and the other side goes to additional paid in capital. Here it historically has been 2 or 3. They just assume going forward it's constant at 2, but it's non-cash. So depreciation and share-based are being added back because they are non-cash expenses. What was the other big part of our indirect approach? Once we'd sorted out our non-cash expenses, we needed to adjust for our movements in working capital, inventory, receivables, and payables. How do we get those? Well, we'll combine two things. Once again, we'll come back to old friend sales forecast. So we know what our sales forecast is. We know what COGS is forecast to be from our percentage margin on sales, our gross margin. Once we've got those two, we will combine them with our days ratios. So remember from the ratios, the techniques reading, we had inventory days, so days of inventory on hand, receivables days, we said was days of sales outstanding, and number of days of payables. If we know that, and we know sales and COGS, we can turn that into an inventory balance, a receivables balance, and a payables balance. And I've just taken one example here. Again, you can track it all through the spreadsheet. But we have a forecasted days ratio. Days of inventory on hand, we called it back in the techniques module. And they forecasted it at 1500. How? They've just used historic information. Looked at historically what the days of inventory were, adjusted for any turmoil, any upset in the recent past, because the period they used was affected by COVID, and adjusted that to say, I think this is what it'll be going forward. Now, if you're thinking, hang on, Richie, this is a ludicrous number. This is a maker of cognac. So their product ages for literally years, hence the rather large number. We have a forecasted days of inventory of 1500. COGS has been forecasted at 347. That used revenue and the gross margin. We know that days of inventory on hand is calculated as inventory over COGS times 365, which means the 1,500 is inventory over COGS 347 times 365. The only missing figure we have there is inventory. Rearrange this, inventory must be 1,500, the days times 347 COGS divided by 365, number of days in the period, gives us 1426. You then compare that, and this is for 2022, the first year they were estimating. Compare that to the historic figure for 2021, and you can get your movement in inventory. Turned out it was a decrease. You can use days of sales outstanding to get receivables. Turns out that would be an increase. And payables days to get payables. Turns out they decreased. And you have your movements in working capital, which turns out to be 64. Actually a decrease in working capital, so we get some released back into cash flow. Add that together with your non-cash adjustments, and they came up with a CFO figure of 281. CFI, well, we had CapEx, the 55, which we predicted as a percentage of revenue. Other, kept it simple, said, we don't know anything else about any other, so we'll assume it's zero. We've got CFI. And CFF, simple again. Let's assume no debt was issued, no shares are issued. Remember, we can charge share-based compensation as an expense without actually issuing any. And I think they just assumed that dividends paid would remain constant. They took a historic figure of 10 to get CFF. You've got CFO, CFI, CFF. You have your total cash flow. And that just leaves the balance sheet, which at that point is easy. And actually, as it points out in the module, if you're using Excel to do this, should be automatic. You've just got to link the right cells. If you've projected your income statement and you've projected your cash flows, the balance sheet should just drop out. How? Well, you know your historic balance sheet. I know my starting point. I know the movements, the flows from the income statement and the cash flow. That should give me my ending balance sheet. Couple of simple examples. Again, you can walk through as many as you like if you have the Excel spreadsheet. But to get PPE for the first year that was forecasted, a historic figure given was 845. We know depreciation and amortization, a percentage of revenue. They forecasted as 36. That would reduce PPE. CapEx, again, just using a percentage of revenue, we said was 55. That would boost PPE. That gives a forecasted PPE balance in the 2022 estimated balance sheet of 864. Another one, payables. Same exact technique as we used when we looked at the movement in inventory. We're going to use the days ratio, this time days of payables, and COGS. We've predicted COGS using the gross margin revenue. COGS was 347. Days of payables was 628. Use that, you'll get a forecast for payables of 597. Again, just rearranging the formula. 628 is the days. That must be my payables over 347 times 365, rearrange that, and you get to 597. So we've gone from income statement, adjusted that to get cash flows, and used them both plus the historic balance sheet to forecast the balance sheet going forward. And then that's just a chain forecast. We can just keep going into the future as many years as we think is relevant, which we'll talk about briefly at the end. Now, having put together our Excel spreadsheet and made our forecasts, let's talk about why they're probably wrong. This LOS asks us to explain how behavioral factors affect analyst forecasts and recommend remedial actions for analyst biases. We've just got to look at a few different behavioral biases. Before we do, let's do one tiny quick exercise just to illustrate one. Question is this. Unfortunately, this is not interactive, so you can't answer right now. But I want you to give me a 90% confidence interval. So back to a bit of quant. We all know what a 90% confidence interval is. But an interval you're 90% confident contains the length of the River Nile. Now, it is unlikely that you know the answer to that, obviously. But all I'm asking you to do is give me an interval, lower end and upper end, that you're 90% confident contains the proper length. Now, as I say, it's not actually interactive, so don't look for any way to submit it. But have a think. Pause the video if you need to. Don't Google it. That spoils everything. And just for fun, what you'll find is the answer, according to the site I Googled anyway, was 4,132 miles. If you guessed in kilometers, then obviously change that. Now, what's the point of that? Well, let's have a look at some biases. It has been shown by study after study after study that experts persistently make forecasting errors resulting from behavioral biases. The first one is the one we just tried to demonstrate: overconfidence. Did your 90% confidence interval contain the correct length of the River Nile? If it did not, you have displayed the classic bias of overconfidence. You are not given any kind of rules around that interval. You could have put down 1 mile to 95,000 miles. And if you're saying you're 90% confident that it would have been in there, then you would have been right. But what researchers have found is that roughly 50% of the time, people's 90% intervals do not contain the right answer to basic questions like this. I won't say basic, I wouldn't have known the answer, but to simple questions, simply constructed questions like that. It's unwarranted faith in your own ability. It's overconfidence. It's more common with people who are making contrarian predictions, so going against what everybody else is saying, going against the norm. How do you mitigate it? Well, in a simple quiz online like this, so if you search, there's loads of little sites that will do this for you, and you can beat the site and beat its conclusion by putting in ridiculous ones like 1 mile to 95 million miles, and it'll just say, yeah, you got that one right. But how do you mitigate it? Share your predictions and review them. Get them peer-reviewed. Widen your confidence intervals, as we've just said. Now, you can't go ridiculous in the real world like this, but be sensible. Don't say, I have predicted profit for the next 5 years, and in 5 years' time, it's going to be $1.38462 million. That's crazy. We mentioned in the techniques reading, do some scenario analysis and give people a range. When you've been through equity, and when you've been through level 2 equity particularly, you're going to have a whole host, for example, of valuation methods. Use all of those valuation methods: an asset-based method, dividend discount model, free cash flow models. Use price multiples. So get a whole range, see what they all give you in different scenarios, and then start to say, okay, well, this is my low end, this is my high end. That makes more sense. Not, I know it's this answer. The illusion of control. Overestimating your ability to control what cannot be controlled. If you choose your own lottery numbers, this is an example of the illusion of control. in terms of financial modeling, putting in more and more and more and more variables, getting to ridiculously complex models because you think the more variables I put in, the closer it will be, the better it will be. Not necessarily. You get diminishing marginal returns. We'll talk when we get to level 2 in regression, when we build on level 1 simple regression and get to multiple. We'll talk about models being parsimonious, adding more and more and more and more independent variables. Well, statistically, you can make it look better in terms of some statistical measures, but it's not a better model. Mitigate that by focusing on the most important variables, and I would add to that, accepting what you cannot control and accepting you're not going to get these things right. Conservatism bias, sometimes known, and certainly in our framework, if you like, you can certainly refer to it as anchoring and adjustment. You maintain your prior views or forecasts by inadequately incorporating new information. You have a number in your head. You have valued this company at 8.4 billion. Now you get new information and you just won't shift from that 8.4. You need to be flexible. You need to put new information into your model and be prepared to review it. And if so, even if you were absolutely married to the idea of this company being a huge buy and 8.4 million at least, okay, be open to the idea that it may no longer be worth that. Can lead to holding on to stocks for too long because you think, no, it should be worth that. Good idea is to throw away your entire model and start again with today's information. Would you buy that stock today with today's information? And often the answer would be no, but you just can't shake the fact that, no, I kind of like it from my original model. Just 2 more. Representativeness bias. It's a mouthful. Classifying information based on past experiences and known classifications. That's really having a kind of insulated worldview. This is how people behave given the people I've met. No, is not an indication of how people behave out there in the wider world. They use the phrase base rate neglect. You can have 2 views. An inside view is the one I've just described. The inside view is to take what you know from your small sample size and say that's how things are. The outside view considers the base rate. The module uses an example of somebody working for a pharmaceutical company and you're asked, what's the typical staffing level? What's the typical research and development spend a month? What's the typical advertising spend a month? How often do you get lawsuits, litigation, so on? Now, the inside view would be to say, okay, well, I work for a pharmaceutical company, so it's this, and this. Well, your company is unique. It will have its own unique circumstances. A better way to do it is to say, look, let's take the outside view and consider the base rate. So the industry as a whole, the average for all pharmaceutical companies. And then, yes, make adjustments if you're trying to apply it to a specific company, but don't just take one as the only example. And confirmation bias. We are all guilty of this in some way, in some walks of life, in some areas, I should say, of life. Seek and notice information that confirms your prior belief. That's why people have become so politically polarized in recent years, because the information you get is now so tailored to tie in to what they know from their algorithms your beliefs are, and it just confirms it over and over again. And if you're honest with yourself, certainly happens for me. You see a piece of information from, or about rather, somebody you don't like, you immediately believe it. You immediately want to share it and say it's a disgrace. You see it about somebody you like, it's probably fake news. And that's just a natural human reaction. It is a natural behavioral bias. To mitigate it, you've got to try and seek opinions that differ. You have to watch the other channel and see what they're saying and try and get a balanced view. Difficult. So let's move on. And next up, something we cover in equities in industry and company analysis. So we don't need to actually teach it or cover it here at all. It's not very efficient to make you go through things twice, watch a video on the same thing twice. So watch this in equity. Just know it is relevant here. Explain how the competitive position of a company based on a Porter's 5 forces analysis affects prices and costs. So here we are. It's Rémy Martin, as I say, they're going through in the underlying readings, a cognac producer, and they have done Porter's 5 forces. Here are the 5 forces, as I say, not too much time on it because it's elsewhere, but first one, threat of substitutes. That's one of the 5 forces. The competitive position and level of competitive advantage of a business is impacted by the threat of substitutes. Are there adequate, numerous substitutes out there that customers should just switch to in a minute without even blinking an eye? Well, for the cognac industry, no. Turns out that consumers are very loyal. There's high brand loyalty. They don't shift to other beverages or high-end spirits. If you're a cognac drinker, you stick to your favorite cognac. So there is a low threat of substitutes. That is good news. If you're an incumbent in the industry, it helps your competitive advantage if there are no substitutes that people will easily switch to. Second one is rivalry. What is the level of competition within the industry? A lot of people incorrectly just tie this to the number of incumbents. Doesn't really matter. You can have very few companies in the industry, in the space, and they could still be highly rivalrous. My favorite example, grocery stores. I seem to use it for everything. But in the UK, when I was at university, the grocery stores just went on a massive, huge price war and started to drop the prices of all sorts of basics, which meant I could eat for about 75 pence for a week by just buying tins of beans for 3p. Because they just put them all in as loss leaders. So not many companies in there, but it was highly rivalrous. Now, obviously, people tend to think of, if you've got lots and lots, you've got perfect competition, then there's rivalry. Could be at either end of the scale. What are we told here for the cognac industry? Market is consolidated. 4 players control 78% of the world market in volume and 84% of global value. And there is low rivalry. It is a high-end product. It is not like beans in Tesco's, the grocery store. They don't drop it down to 2p to try and sell it. It is a luxury product. So they keep their prices high. There aren't any other producers who can come in because, and if you read the background of the case, it's highly controlled who can actually make cognac and call their product cognac. It's geographically restricted. Next up, bargaining power of suppliers. How powerful are your suppliers? Do they hold a sword over your head or not? Let's have a look at what happens in the cognac industry. A large number of small independent vineyards supply inputs. That's good news. What you don't want is to be utterly reliant on one supplier. If you are, that's when they can hold you over a barrel and say, look, this is what you're going to pay me. I know you can't go anywhere else. Or at least if you try and go somewhere else, it's going to cause at least short-term disruption to your supply chain. Most of the distillation is carried out by a large body of independent distillers that sell to the big houses. So a large body is kind of, all right, how much power do they have? But it says it's kind of low, medium. So really a neutral, nothing I'm too concerned about. Bargaining power of buyers. The opposite. How powerful are your customers? If you have 2 or 3 major customers, once again, they have the power. They can demand the price that they pay. Again, grocery stores. I know it gets a bit tedious, but it's a great example of almost everything in life. If you are a farmer and you have a contract for one of these big stores, you could sell all of your produce to them. But if you're going to do that, they are going to wield their power over you. It's much less risky for you if you have a diverse base of fragmented customers who can't get together and rise up against you. For the cognac industry, premium beverage sold primarily to wine and spirits retail outlets. They do not coordinate purchasing. They can't get together and rise up. Premium beverages consumed primarily in small and fragmented on-premises outlets. Again, all fragmented, very difficult for them to get any power against you. So that's good news. Finally, threat of new entrants. For the cognac industry, is it likely that new entrants will come in and eat into your slice of the pie, start to force prices down, start to compete? Well, no, producers have long-term contracts with suppliers in the area. There are really high barriers to entry. For one, as I say, it is restricted geographically. Secondly, these premium beverages are aged for years, as we said earlier. So you've got to get in and somehow immediately have that stock available. It's very difficult to get into the business. So the threat of new entrants coming in and eroding your competitive advantage is low. So out of these 5 factors, this seems a pretty good business to be in if you're looking to earn positive economic profits in the long run. Remember, from the world of economics, you would expect in the long run, in a competitive market, for your economic profits to be eroded down to their equilibrium value of 0. To maintain positive economics in the long run, you have to get some sort of competitive advantage. And this situation looks like it might be one that would help you. So you can see why it's here. It's in equity, as I say. We'll do it in a lot more detail there. But it's useful here to assess the profit potential of a company. Can they maintain their competitive advantage, which obviously will spill over into sales growth, higher margins, potentially growing margins, and so on. Next up, explain how to forecast industry and company sales and costs when they are subject to price inflation or deflation. Pretty simple one, this. The key point really is that the impact of inflation differs between companies, so it's going to be difficult to decide who gets affected the most or the least, but also between revenues and expenses. The classic question we're asking as analysts when we put these forecasts together, if input prices start rising, so we're treating this inflation obviously as just exogenous, so we are hit with these rising input prices, how do we deal with them? Ideally, we just pass them straight on to our customers and say, excellent, my input prices have gone up. Unfortunately, you have to pay more. But can we do that? Some companies can. If you have brand loyalty, if you are a monopoly, all of that helps. If it's highly competitive, it's unlikely. So key factors, industry structure. What does the industry look like? Again, Porter's 5 forces would help you. Good example they run through in the module. The US beer market, it's a very alcohol-related module, it's got to be said. US beer market, it's an oligopoly. AB InBev has 50% of the market share, dominates, and the customer base is fragmented. The way the distribution network works, it goes through wholesalers, different distribution networks in every state. They can't all get together and demand one price. It allows the oligopolists to pass on any price rises, and hence US beer prices generally do rise and fall with input costs. Obviously good news for the business. European beer market, on the other hand, is distributed through a concentrated customer base. You have huge buyers like Tesco's. There is no big dominant brewer. So there's more power with the customer. Hence, it's more difficult to pass those increases on. And statistical analysis shows that changes in European beer prices tend to be below inflation, so they can't pass it all through, which is obviously going to hurt them. And secondly, elasticity. Increasing prices. So if we have inflation that we're trying to pass on and you increase prices, if demand is elastic, that can have a negative impact. We know this from our basic price elasticity of demand in economics. If we're elastic, price elasticity of demand in absolute terms is greater than 1. Increase your price by 10%, your quantity drops by more than that. What about deflation then? Well, yep, dropping prices may benefit volume in the short run, but competitors tend to react. So any benefit will be short-lived as everybody else drops their prices as well. Again, we saw that back in the world of market structures in e-com. So what can companies do if they can't pass it on to customers? And as analysts, what do we need to consider when we're putting together our cost projections? Well, first one here, consider whether the company might be hedging. Airlines is always a great example. Imagine you're an airline and you're looking at your fuel costs. Fuel costs could be up to 40, 50, 60% of your cost base. If you don't want to be exposed to changes in fuel prices, you lock it in with a derivative, with a forward contract. Now, if that's the case and you forecast as an analyst, I think oil prices are going to rise in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, you need to check if the company you are forecasting for has already locked in a price for that period. They will be able to delay the impact of that inflation. Think about company or industry, I should say, specific factors. Agriculture, obviously affected by the weather. So if you've got any companies that have huge agricultural products, coffee bean harvests, for example, and the weather is bad, there is a bad harvest year, that is clearly going to affect your cost projection. Think about how they're going to deal with that. Can they switch to another provider? Can they switch to a different country, a different geographical area to get hold of their supply? Now, vertical integration, that can offset the impact of inflation. If you are selling coffee, you can go back and own a coffee bean plantation. And the availability of substitutes, kind of touched on that already. Can you turn elsewhere? That can offset the impact of inflation. Or you can accept you're paying it, but try and save cash elsewhere. So be aware as an analyst, increasing raw material costs might lead to a decrease in discretionary spend. Advertising may be cut, research and development may be cut. So you might want to build that into your short-term forecasts. However, thinking long-term, obviously if you cut back on these for long enough, it could hurt your brand. Now that was a lot of talking. We've actually got a break for some numbers now. The LOS wants us to know that analysts can use common size analysis. Saw this back in the income statement module to forecast the impact of price rises. So we've got here for two companies, a classic common size income statement. In a common size income statement, every line, so all of these lines, are expressed as a percentage of net sales. Hence, net sales obviously is 100%. We have COGS and the gross margin, SG&A depreciation, and EBIT for the two companies. Company S, lower gross margin, but higher EBIT. That could be important going forward. And then we're asked, what happens if each company experiences a 10% inflation in all costs except depreciation? So this is staying where it is, but everything else is going by 10%. What will happen? Well, company S will experience a greater decline in gross margin. Why? Because it has the lower gross margin to start with. Let's take a look and just make sure we believe that. A 10% increase in all costs, so COGS will go from 50 up to 55 for company S, so its gross margin will be down to 45. We can then calculate how far that dropped. Well, 5% drop on a starting point of 50. That is a 10% decrease in its gross margin. Company C, COGS will go from 36, so it's going to increase by about, 3.6, about 4. So let's say it goes up to 40%. That means our gross margin is now only 60. That is a drop from 64 to 60 of 4. It was at 64, 4 or 64. That's only a drop of about 6%. So indeed, because it had a lower margin to start with, it will fall, or experience rather, a greater decline. You can probably guess then what happens to the EBIT and why this example is set up as it is. Because company C has the lower EBIT margin to start with, it will experience the greater decline. Now let's just make sure we believe that. SG&A, 31%. 10% increase in that is about 3%, so that's going to go up to 34. Depreciation, remember, is staying where it is. 45 less 37. EBIT margin is down to 8. It's dropped by 8. It was 16. That's a pretty easy calculation. It's dropped by 50%. And company C, 47, is going to go up by about 5, so to about 52. Depreciation stays where it is, so 60 minus 56, down to 4%. That is a drop of 9, was 13%, dropped by 9 from 13. That's about a 69% drop. Company C has a greater decline in the EBIT margin. Why? Once again, because it was lower to begin with. So just a demo of how we can use common size analysis to look at the potential impact of inflation. And finally, explain considerations in the choice of an explicit forecast horizon and an analyst's choices in developing projections beyond the short-term forecast horizon. So 2 elements to this. And once more, when you get to equity, you will see how we develop our models. And when we have multi-stage models, typically an analyst trying to value, let's say, an equity will say, I've got a 3-4 year horizon. I will forecast my metric for those 4 years. Let's say it's just dividends. I will forecast my dividends for year 1, 2, 3, and 4. Beyond that horizon, it starts to get too uncertain to try and forecast, so I will just set up a terminal value. Beyond that 4-year explicit horizon, I'll say that's what I think my terminal value is going to be to represent the value of the going concern at that point and discount it all back to today. We've got to look at the choices we make in getting to both of those, the horizon for the short-term explicit dividends and how we get that terminal value. So let's identify the factors that will affect that choice. First of all, your short-term horizon, how long do I forecast for, may be impacted by the investment strategy for which the security is being considered, because that will tell you how long you're going to hold it. You want to make sure you forecasted for the entire period that this security is likely to be held. Most professional firms will tell you their investment horizon. So it could be, for example, 3 to 5 years, which equates to average annual turnover for securities of 33% for 3 years, 20% for 5. Cyclicality is important. You should make sure your forecast period is long enough to reach an expected mid-cycle sales profitability level. You don't want to be left with a really high figure or a really low figure because you didn't get to a more, and we'll use this term in a moment, normal state. Obviously, company-specific factors. The module points out particularly recent acquisitions or restructurings. If that's just occurred in the last year, 2, 3 years even, you need to give it time for the full impact of that acquisition or restructuring to be realized. Or you do what you're told. Depends on the organization you work for. Lots just have very strict criteria on this is how we forecast. This is how long we can forecast for, and you use the pro forma model. For longer term projections, so we have our short term explicit horizon that we've decided upon. Going beyond that is sometimes necessary. If you're going beyond that, perhaps to get to a terminal value, make sure you're using a normalized figure. Might be earnings, might be free cash flows. Normalized means mid-cycle, so not too high, not too low, just Goldilocks, and without any unusual or temporary factors. So get to a normal stage of the cycle. Make sure you're through these acquisitions, restructurings, as we talked about, and everything is settled down. Use historical data to calculate a trend. If you've got 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 years of data, you might be able to spot a little bit of regression analysis, a nice long-term trend. And if you can get to a normalized figure, for example, you might be using, let's say, a DCF, a discounted cash flow model. You're trying to find the present value of all future free cash flows. You normalize your free cash flow by taking account of all of these factors. And then comes the really tricky bit. You try and work out what that free cash flow is going to do in perpetuity. Can I now predict where those earnings or that free cash flow is going forever? Obviously, pretty tricky. Key things to take into account. Doesn't matter how many years of data you have from the past is not prologue. Are you going to be able to maintain those growth rates going forward? Some can. If you can consistently reinvent yourself, reinvent your product, and innovate, then you may be able to maintain those margins. If you're a mature company with no new products coming down the pipeline, then your profits might be about to slow down and growth may tend back towards zero. It is obviously critical to try and spot any future inflection points where things beyond the point of inflection are not like they were before. So big changes in the economy, massive economic disruption. We've been through COVID. We've been through the financial crisis in 2008. Almost impossible to predict that kind of thing. But if the warning signs are there, there's no excuse for not at least building in some scenario analysis into your projections to try and take account of what could possibly happen. Remember, widen your confidence intervals. Don't be overconfident. This is what I think is going to happen, but if there is a major disruption, this is what could happen.